Well, welcome to the Devon and Cornwall Record Society's third in its new series of podcasts. And I think we're delighted to be able to welcome Stephen Rippon, who is a professor of landscape archaeology at Exeter University. Many people know him from leading the Exeter Place and Time project. And this book is, I think, of particular interest in Exeter, but much wider beyond as well. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Now, can you start off just tell me a little bit about the new book? Or books, I should say.
Well, yeah, there's two books that we produced from this sort of major project that was looking at not just the archaeology and history of Exeter, but its wider hinterlands. So Exeter's place within the Devon landscape, the wider southwest of Britain, but also a major theme was its international trading connections. And the book really came about because in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was a lot of pioneering archaeological work carried out in Exeter. But back then, although there was funding available to undertake archaeological excavations, there wasn't really very much funding available to study what was found and then produce a final report so that everything that was found could be disseminated to the wider public. And so Exeter, like many other English towns and cities, developed this backlog of, if you like, unpublished archaeological work. And the aims of the Exeter Place in Time project was to write up reports on 4 of the most important excavations, and also to sort of use lots of fancy new scientific techniques that hadn't even been dreamt of when the excavations first happened. And these fancy techniques enabled us to analyze the objects in ways that are terribly clever and have told us a lot more about the artifacts that were found than was sort of believed 20, 30, 40 years ago.
I mean, this is the thing which I think non-archaeologists like me are just fascinated that you can look at an old tooth and discover things that are unthinkable just a few years ago. I mean, it's just one of your many, not just sources, they're just ways of deciphering the past.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the teeth, for example. One of the most common finds on archaeological sites are animal bones. And literally thousands and thousands of animal bones were excavated from various sites within Exeter. And back in the 1970s and the 1980s, what archaeologists could do with those bones was identify whether they were, say, cattle or sheep or pigs. And they could say how old they were when the animals died. So, for example, if you have a large number of cattle being brought to Exeter when they're young adults, that means that they'd been bred primarily for their meat. They were prime beef age. If you get lots of animals that are actually into their real old age, for cattle, this means they've been used to pull ploughs for most of their lives, for example. So that was really the limit of what we could say about animal bone assemblages in the 1970s and 1980s. But now we can, for example, analyze the chemistry, the chemical composition of the teeth. And the chemistry of our teeth reflects the diet that we have. And for cattle and sheep, their diet was primarily grass. Now, the chemistry of grass is different on, for example, Dartmoor to grass in the immediate hinterland of Exeter, to, for example, grass further east in central southern England. So what we were able to do was analyze the chemistry of animal teeth in the Roman and medieval deposits of Exeter. And what we find is that Exeter was getting its animals from different places at different times. So when the Roman army rocked up in the 50s AD, they seem to have brought animals with them. The cattle, the chemistry of the teeth in the cattle suggests that the cattle had spent most of their life, if you like, to the east of Exeter. What we see over time as Exeter was established as a Roman and a medieval town, the cattle that fed Exeter came primarily from the immediate hinterland of Exeter, but interestingly also Dartmoor. Now, historians have told us that there's good sources for the seasonal movement of livestock up onto Dartmoor. Howard Fox has written the best book on that. But we didn't know if that happened in the Roman period. Well, through this archaeological analysis, we can show that cattle were being moved up onto Dartmoor in the summer and then brought back down into the lowlands as early as the Roman period. So that's, I think, a nice example, actually, of how we can use modern scientific techniques to analyze all these artifacts that were dug up in the 1970s and 1980s and have been carefully curated by the Royal Albert Memorial Museum.
It's fascinating to the point of almost magic. You think of it, it just doesn't make sense that one can do all that. It's one of the fabulous things going on with archaeology at the moment, I think. Now, what else surprised you while you were writing the book? Did anything jump out at you? You thought, oh, crikey, I hadn't thought about that.
I think that the two things that I would say were the biggest surprises for me. Firstly, on the scientific front, we carried out a lot of analysis of the clays that were used to make the various pots that were dug up in Exeter. And there was a particular type of pottery that was very common early in the Roman period. And these were called fortress wares because they are often found in the Roman legionary fortress. But an analysis of the clay shows it was actually clay from what's called the Bovey beds in the area of Bovey Tracy, where once again, historians have been able to tell us about the more recent history of the potting industry and the tile making industry at Bovey Tracy. But our archaeological work has actually shown that those clays were being used way back in the Roman period for making pots. The other thing that I think was a huge surprise was some work that John Allen did, former keeper of archaeology at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum, but also a very clever historian. And he took Exeter's very, very rich archival material and for the first time was able to take documentary references to individual tenements within Exeter and actually locate precisely where they are. And when we sort of walk along Exeter streets, particularly the high streets, I think all too often we don't look up above the shop fronts. Mm-hmm. If you do, what you see is the roof line is all jiggedy-jaggedy, and you can see how preserved within Exeter's plans are the old medieval tenements. The little tenements had a very narrow street frontage, but stretched back a long way from the high street. Look above the modern shop fronts and you can see these medieval tenements preserved within the existing buildings. And John was able to identify who lived in some of these tenements going all the way back to the 16th and the 17th centuries. And it was a remarkable piece of historical work. And I remember when I was first appointed to Exeter in the 1990s, various historians had told me about this wonderful collection of old deeds, but how sadly it was impossible to identify where any of these tenements were. That was the accepted view, but John Allen's remarkable work showed that it is actually possible to do that. And in the second of the two volumes that we published, there's a very detailed report by John on all of this historical research that he did on, it was primarily St Pancras parish, which partly fronts onto the high street, but of course is largely the area that is now the Guildhall shopping centre.
Well, I mean, I've gone through both books and I have to admit, they are wonderful, and what an addition to Exeter and beyond. They're only £35 each, which is a bargain really for what they are. But now I think you've explained this right. Oxbow Books website has a means of buying the books, but you can also get a freely downloadable PDF through that site as well, through the ordering technique.
Yeah, if you just go onto the Oxbow Books website, in their search bar, just write Exeter, a place in time. And for each book, you'll get 2 options. You can buy the hardback for £35, or if you scroll down, you have to go through the process of ordering a free PDF. So you just tick the box for that. You'll see the price is £0, but you do have to go through that process of ordering it, but you won't have to pay anything. And then they'll just email you the PDF.
I mean, what a bargain for 50 years of research looking at life 2,000 years ago and then some. So amazing, absolutely amazing. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for your time. And, anyone who's looked at this book is already, is watching this is saying, oh, wow, there's a lot more to be said about this. We could be spending a couple hours and even, then just scratch the surface. But you should be commended for such a contribution to Exeter.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I hope people who are watching this will look out for the next in our series. Right. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.